The morning Nora Voss agreed to marry a man she'd never met, she was standing in the hospital parking lot at 6 a.m., still wearing yesterday's scrubs, eating a granola bar that tasted like cardboard and trying to remember if she'd slept at all. She hadn't. She'd been awake since the call came through at 2, her brother Elliot, voice low and tight the way it got when he was trying not to panic, telling her the number. The debt. Their mother's debt, specifically accumulated over 4 years of bad investments and worse men, now sitting in the hands of someone whose name Elliot said like it was a loaded gun. Kieran Ashford. He wants to meet, Elliot had said. Tell him no Nora. Just her name. That was enough. She'd driven to the meeting in silence, parked outside a building in the financial district that looked like money itself had been turned into glass and steel, and told herself she was just going to listen. She was 31 years old. She was a trauma surgeon. She did not get scared by buildings. The man who met her in the lobby was not what she expected. She didn't know what she expected. Someone older, probably. Someone who looked the way the debt felt, crushing, immovable, mean. Kieran Ashford was 44, which she would learn later, but she could have guessed within a few years. He had the kind of face that had probably been arresting when he was young and had only sharpened since. Jaw that looked like it had been cut rather than grown gray, threading through dark hair at the temples, and eyes that were an unsettling pale brown, almost amber, that tracked her from the moment she stepped off the elevator like she was a variable he was already calculating. He didn't offer his hand. "Dr. Voss," he said. "Mr. Ashford." She didn't look away, though something in her chest wanted her to. He gestured to a chair across from the desk in a corner office so high up she could see the whole city spread out like something he owned, and she sat, and she crossed her legs, and she held herself very still the way she did in the OR when something was going wrong and falling apart wasn't an option. He told her the number again. The same number Elliot had said. Then he told her what he wanted. "I need a wife," he said. "Someone presentable. Someone who doesn't need managing. A contract arrangement, 12 months. At the end, the debt is cleared. Your mother's name is removed from everything. Your brother gets a clean slate." Nora stared at him. "You're joking," she said. "I'm not known for it." She looked at his face and understood that was true. Why not just hire someone? There are people who do this. There are agency. I don't want someone from an agency. He leaned back slightly, a minimal movement that somehow communicated enormous patience. I want someone who won't be a liability. Someone with a career, a reputation, a reason to behave professionally. Someone who has as much to lose from this arrangement falling apart as I do. The silence in the room had weight. "And you think that's me? Your mother owes me $2.3 million, he said. "I think that gives you a significant incentive to be cooperative." She drove home. She sat on the floor of her kitchen while her daughter Poppy slept upstairs. 6 years old, gap-toothed, currently obsessed with marine biology, and Nora put her face in her hands and breathed. Then she called Elliot back. "Say yes," he said, before she'd even spoken. "Elliot, Nora, please. He'll take the house. He'll take everything Mom has left. And then he'll come for us because our names are on some of it. I didn't realize. I should have caught it sooner. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "Stop." She pressed her fingers to her eyes. In the dark behind them, she saw Poppy's face. She saw her daughter's bedroom with the glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling that they'd stuck up together on a Tuesday night 2 years ago, Nora standing on the bed in her socks and Poppy directing from below with the authority of a tiny general. "I need you to stop talking." He stopped. "One condition," she said finally. "I negotiate the contract myself. Every term. He doesn't like it. We walk." There was a pause. Then, "He'll agree to that." "You don't know that." "I think he will." She went back the next morning. She brought a yellow legal pad and a pen, and she sat down across from Kieran Ashford in that same high-glass office, and she looked at him steadily. "I have conditions," she said. Something moved through his eyes, too fast to name. "I assumed you would. First, my daughter doesn't meet you for at least 60 days. She doesn't know what this is. As far as she's concerned, her mother is dating someone. If at any point she becomes uncomfortable, the arrangement ends regardless of where we are in the timeline." A pause. "Agreed? Second, I keep my apartment. I'll stay at your residence Tuesday through Sunday for appearances, but my space remains mine. I need somewhere that's just mine, reasonable. Third, no physical. She stopped, recalibrated. The arrangement is professional. Public appearances, shared events, whatever is required for the image. Nothing else unless it's mutually decided and explicitly discussed. He held her gaze, agreed. Fourth, you tell me the truth. I don't mean your secrets. I mean, if something is happening that affects my safety or my daughter's safety, you tell me. I will not be protected through ignorance. The pause before this agreement was longer. That's more complicated, I know. She didn't move, but it's non-negotiable. He looked at her for a long moment, the amber eyes very still, doing that calculating thing, and then he said, agreed. She wrote it all down, every word. She had her hospital attorney review it before she signed, which required explaining the situation in the most clinical terms possible and watching the woman's expression do something complicated. And she signed it 2 days later on a Tuesday and moved her overnight bag into Kieran Ashford's penthouse on the Upper West Side that Friday, while Poppy stayed with Elliot and his wife, who had been told only that Mama had a work thing. The first 2 weeks were almost manageable. He was rarely home before 9. She was rarely home before 8. They moved around the large, beautiful, aggressively minimalist apartment like opposite charged particles, polite, careful, keeping to the edges of each other. He made coffee in the morning without offering to make hers, and she didn't expect him to. She left the kitchen clean without being asked. Small courtesies, but real ones. The kind that cost nothing and mean something anyway. Then there was an event. A fundraiser for something financial and prestigious. She wore the dress Elliot had told her to buy and stood beside Kieran in a room full of people who all seemed to know each other very well. And she shook hands and smiled and answered questions about what she did with the same quiet authority she used with patients' families. And twice she felt Kieran's hand move to the small of her back, not grabbing, just present, a point of contact. And each time something in her body did something she didn't have a name for yet. In the car home, they sat in silence for a while. You're good at that, he said. She looked at him. Rooms like that, he clarified. You read them. Most people can't. I read trauma bays, she said. Lots of people, lots of noise, 1 or 2 things that actually matter. Same principle. He looked at her the way he had in that first meeting, like she was a variable he'd calculated wrong. She turned back to the window. It started as a small shift. She noticed things, which was the problem. She was a noticer by training and temperament. It was what made her a good surgeon. And so she noticed the way he moved through his own space, which was controlled but not cold. The way he spoke to the 2 staff members who came during the week, which was direct but not unkind. She noticed a bookshelf in his home office that was disorganized in a way nothing else in the apartment was, which meant he actually read them. She noticed that he worked late not because he was driven, but because, as far as she could tell, he had nowhere else to be. She didn't think about that too hard. Poppy met him at week 9. They were at Nora's apartment on a Sunday. She'd negotiated Sunday dinners at hers as a condition of sanity. And Kieran had come to pick up some files she'd signed. And Poppy had appeared at the top of the stairs in her pajamas with a stuffed manta ray under her arm, looked at Kieran with the unself-conscious scrutiny of a 6-year-old and said, Are you the man Mama works with sometimes? Kieran looked at Nora. Nora held very still. Something like that, he said. Poppy considered this. Do you know about bioluminescence? Another pause. Tell me. And Poppy did. For about 11 minutes, while Kieran Ashford, who moved billions of dollars and intimidated entire rooms of people with a look, stood in Nora's living room doorway and listened to a 6-year-old explain how deep-sea creatures made their own light. He asked 2 questions. Both were good ones. Poppy declared him pretty okay and went back to bed. In the hallway after, Nora looked at him. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know. He picked up the files. She's smart. She is. A pause. Thank you. He nodded once and left. She stood in the hallway for a moment after the door closed, feeling something pull at the edges of her chest like a thread being tugged slowly loose. She should have paid more attention to the thread. The call came on a Wednesday, 3 months into the arrangement. She was in the middle of a surgery when the message reached her. Not to her directly, but through the hospital's emergency contact protocol, which meant it was serious. She finished the repair, scrubbed out, found the message. Kieran Ashford. Immediate. Do not come to the penthouse. There was a number she didn't recognize. She called it from the hospital parking garage. A man answered, calm, professional, with the specific kind of neutrality that meant he was used to bad situations. He told her there had been an incident. He told her it wasn't Kieran who was hurt. He told her someone had used her name to access information about Kieran's schedule. Someone used my name, she said. Yes, ma'am. Who? A pause. We're working on that. She drove to the secondary address he gave her, a townhouse in the West Village she hadn't known existed, which told her something, and Kieran met her at the door, looking like someone who had been managing an emergency for 6 hours and would continue to manage it indefinitely. He was still in his work clothes. There was a cut along his jaw that had been cleaned but not covered. She registered the cut before she registered anything else, which was its own kind of information. You're hurt, she said, superficially. Let me see it. She moved toward him. He stepped back once, a reflex, and she stopped. I'm a trauma surgeon, Kieran. Let me see it. He held very still. She stepped forward and turned his face toward the light with 2 fingers under his chin, which was the most direct contact they'd had in 3 months of living adjacent to each other. And she looked at the cut and assessed it and said, it needs a closure strip, not stitches. Do you have a first aid kit? Cabinet under the bathroom sink. She found the kit and came back and sat across from him, and she cleaned the cut with the efficiency she brought to everything clinical, and he stayed still in a way that felt like it cost him something, and neither of them spoke for most of it. Tell me what happened, she said, pressing the strip into place. You told me you would. That was condition 4. A long silence. Someone I was in business with years ago believes I have something that belongs to him, Kieran said. He's been looking for leverage. Apparently he found it. In me, in the arrangement, in the fact that it exists. He looked at her directly. I didn't anticipate that. I should have. She sat back. What does he want? A negotiation, which is not what it sounds like when he says it. She folded the wrapper from the closure strip into a neat square, which was something she did when she was thinking. Is Poppy safe? Yes. I made sure of it before I contacted you. Elliot? Yes. She looked at him. He held her gaze without flinching, which she had learned was something he always did, and usually she read it as control. But right now she read something else underneath it. Something that looked like the beginning of tired, like a man who'd been holding a wall up for a long time. Okay, she said. He blinked, just slightly. Okay, I'm not leaving, she said, if that's what you're wondering. That's not what I do when things get difficult. She stood, smoothed her jacket. But I need you to stop managing what I know. I can't help you navigate something I can't see. He was quiet for a long moment. In the dim light of the townhouse, the cut along his jaw stood out pale and clean, and he looked at her with those amber eyes, and something in them shifted. Not dramatically. Nothing with Kieran was dramatic, but she saw it. There are things I haven't told you, he said, about why the arrangement started. She sat back down. The story came out in pieces the way real things did. Not clean, not sequential, with stops and starts and one long pause where he stood at the window and she let him stand there. The short version was this. The debt her mother owed was real, but the amount had been deliberately inflated. It had been a mechanism, a pressure point, a way to get Nora specifically into a position of obligation, not by Kieran, by the man who was now threatening them both, a man named Voss, her mother's 3rd husband, a man she'd spent years not thinking about. He used my mother, Nora said. Yes, to get to me. He believed I would bring you into my life if the incentive was significant enough. He wanted access to information I control, through you. A pause. He was wrong about several things, including how I would respond. Nora was very still. How did you respond? I didn't use you. He said it quietly, which somehow made it hit harder than if he'd said it loudly. The terms I offered were genuine. The contract was real. I could have made the situation coercive in ways you wouldn't have recognized. I chose not to. She thought about the first meeting, the legal pad, the conditions she'd set, one by one, and the way he'd agreed to each of them. Why? She said. He looked at her for a long moment. Because you walked in there and you were frightened and you didn't show it once. You sat across from me and you negotiated like it was a board meeting. You told me what you needed and you didn't apologize for it. Something moved through his expression, very briefly. I didn't want to be another person who took advantage of that. The thread in her chest pulled completely loose. She didn't move, didn't let herself, not yet, because she was someone who thought before she acted, who looked at a situation from all its angles, who had a daughter and a career and a life she'd built from scratch after a marriage that had tried to hollow her out. She knew about men who seemed trustworthy. She had the scar tissue to prove it. But she also knew, in the specific embodied way, she knew clinical things, not as an idea but as a fact her body had arrived at before her mind, that what he just said was true. Tell me the rest, she said. All of it. He did. It took 2 hours. She asked questions, good ones, she thought, sharp ones, the kind that tested the edges of a story for places where it didn't hold, and his answers held. Every time. And somewhere in the second hour, sitting in a townhouse she hadn't known existed, across from a man she'd agreed to marry on paper for 12 months and had apparently been learning against her will for the past 4, she understood that she was in significantly more trouble than the original debt. The kind of trouble you didn't necessarily want to get out of. The next 6 weeks were harder and better simultaneously, which she would not have believed possible. Harder because the threat was real and required adjustments, a security detail she hated, a temporary change to Poppy's school pickup, conversations with Elliot that required her to tell him more than she wanted to. Better because something between her and Kieran had changed. In that townhouse, some wall thinned, and they moved through the apartment differently now, toward each other rather than alongside. He brought her coffee in the morning. She didn't comment on it. She left the light on in the kitchen when she knew he was coming home late, and he didn't comment on that either. Small things, the kind that cost nothing. There was a night, a Tuesday. She would remember it specifically, because she'd had a brutal shift and lost a patient she shouldn't have lost, a 40-year-old man with 2 kids and a wife who'd been waiting, where she came home and sat on the kitchen floor, back against the cabinet, still in her coat, and didn't move. She heard him come in. She heard him stop when he saw her. He didn't say anything. He didn't ask if she was okay, which she would have hated, or tell her it wasn't her fault, which she knew and didn't need. He just came and sat on the floor beside her, back against the same cabinet, and stayed there for maybe 20 minutes, until she was ready to get up. She didn't thank him. She just got up, and he got up, and they both went to bed. But she lay in the dark for a long time afterward, feeling the weight of those 20 minutes like something she hadn't known she was starving for. The confrontation happened on a Friday. It came in through an email to her hospital account, which it had no business reaching, from a name she recognized with a coldness that moved through her slowly, like ice water. Her stepfather, the man who'd been her mother's worst mistake and had apparently decided to extend the offer to Nora. The email was precise and ugly. It named specific things: Poppy's school, the route Nora drove on Thursdays, her brother's home address, not as threats, exactly, but close enough that the difference felt deliberately cruel. An implied message: I know where you all are. I know what you are to Kieran. Now let's negotiate. She forwarded it to Kieran without adding a word. He called her within 4 minutes. Where are you? Hospital. She was in a supply closet, which was where she'd gone to be alone, and she was embarrassed by that, which was something to address later. I'm fine. I needed you to see it. I've seen it. His voice was controlled, which she now knew meant he was more upset than it sounded. Poppy is safe. I've already confirmed it. Elliot's house has someone outside. I'm coming to you. You don't have to. Nora. Her name quiet, direct, the way he said it when he meant it specifically. I'm coming to you. He came. He appeared outside the hospital 40 minutes later, and she got in the car, and he didn't immediately start driving, just looked at her in that direct way, and she looked back, and something she'd been holding for weeks finally shifted in her chest. He did this to you on purpose, she said. Yes, he used my mother to get to me, and he used me to get to you, and he thought that would be straightforward because he didn't think I was anything more than a pressure point. She paused. That makes me angry. It should. I want to be part of how this ends. She held his gaze, not protected, Not told what I need to know afterward. Part of it. The pause was long, long enough that she thought he might say no, that this was the place where the wall came back up. There's a meeting, he said. Monday. It ends it. I want to be in the room. Another long pause. Amber eyes, still measuring, but what he was measuring, she thought, had changed. It wasn't whether she could be a useful variable. It was whether he could do what she was asking of him, which was a different calculation entirely. All right, he said. The meeting was in a conference room in a building she didn't know, with 4 people she also didn't know, and her stepfather, who looked exactly the way she remembered, neat, self-satisfied, the kind of man whose cruelty organized itself into reason so perfectly that it took you years to name it. He looked at her with something she recognized as triumph, which lasted approximately 3 seconds. Kieran set a folder on the table. He didn't sit. He stood at the head of the room with the quality she'd originally read as coldness and now understood differently. It wasn't coldness. It was clarity. The clarity of a person who had looked at every angle of a situation and arrived at a conclusion and was done considering alternatives. He laid out, precisely and without flourish, what he had. Bank records, communications, the structure of the original manipulation, the names of people who had cooperated with it. He named the legal exposure. He named what would happen if the folder left the room intact and what would happen if it didn't. Her stepfather's expression moved through several things in quick succession. She watched it happen. There was something deeply satisfying about it, which she noted and did not apologize for. When it was over, when her stepfather had left with considerably less than he'd arrived with and considerably more to worry about, she stood in the hallway, outside the conference room, and breathed. Kieran came to stand beside her. "You didn't need me in there," she said. "No," he said. "You let me be there anyway." "Yes." She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her, and there was nothing calculated in it. Or maybe there was, but it wasn't calculation she minded, because she calculated too. She'd been calculating since the first morning in the parking garage, and what she kept arriving at was the same answer. "The 12 months are up in 6 weeks," she said. "I know. That was always how it was going to end." "Yes." A pause. "It doesn't have to." The city was audible somewhere below them, far off and continuous, the specific noise of a place that never quite went quiet. She looked at him and thought about the coffee in the mornings, and the kitchen floor on the Tuesday she'd lost the patient, and Poppy's voice saying, "Do you know about bioluminescence?" and the way he'd said, "Tell me," like he meant it. "You'd have to actually be part of our life," she said. "Not a contract, not a careful arrangement. My daughter's Tuesday nights, and the terrible movies she makes me watch, and the fact that I work strange hours and come home tired and sometimes I'm difficult." "You're not difficult," he said. "You're precise. There's a difference." She looked at him. He looked back. 6 weeks, she said, "is enough time to figure it out." "It is," he agreed. She thought, standing in that hallway, about the version of herself in the hospital parking lot on that first morning. Granola bar, yesterday's scrubs, the call from Elliot sitting in her chest like a stone. That woman had been so certain that agreeing to this meant losing something, had held herself so tightly, negotiated so carefully, built every wall with such deliberate care. She hadn't lost anything. She thought that woman would be surprised. She thought she might need to sit with that for a while, the way she sat with most things, quietly, without hurrying, letting herself actually feel it. She was 31 years old. She was a trauma surgeon. She had a daughter who could explain bioluminescence for 11 minutes without taking a breath, and a brother who would do anything for her, and a life she had rebuilt from scratch once already. She could build something again, differently this time, with more information and better terms, and a man who had sat on a kitchen floor beside her in the dark without saying a word, because he understood that sometimes the most useful thing you could offer was just to be there. She reached over and took Kieran's hand. He turned his palm up without hesitation, like he'd been waiting. Like it was the most natural thing, the two of them standing in a hallway in a city that never went quiet, holding on.